Hello all, and thank you so much for coming to this presentation. My name is Amanda Klysing, and I am a PhD student at Lund University. My dissertation project focuses on how we represent different social categories in our mind. And in these studies that I'm presenting today, the question that me and my co-authors wanted to investigate was if language reforms that seek to be gender exclusive are actually so, or if they unintentionally exclude those who defy gendered expectations. To start from the beginning, information about gender is encoded in different languages in different ways. The two languages that I will focus on today, Swedish and English, are what is called natural gendered languages. What that means is that gender is primarily grammatically encoded through the use of the third person singular pronoun. In English, she or he, and in Swedish, han or hon. So what these gendered pronouns do is that they affect our mental representation of who they are referring to, such that feminine forms linguistically represent women and masculine forms linguistically represent men. However, both Swedish and English have the option to use non-gendered third-person pronouns. In English, singular they has been in use as a gender-neutral pronoun since at least the 1300s, even though its usage is under some debate today. Besides singular they, there are also multiple gender-neutral neo-pronouns in English. A neo-pronoun is a pronoun that has been actively created to be gender-neutral or non-binary, and that may or may not be officially recognized as part of an established language. In these studies, we focus on the English neo-pronoun sie, which has been in use since the late 1990s and has become more well-known lately, but it's still not a very established part of English. In Swedish, the neo-pronoun hen was introduced to the mainstream in the 2010s as a pronoun to be used either for individuals with a non-binary gender identity or as a gender generic pronoun when gender was irrelevant or should be excluded for other reasons. After a heated national debate, hen was included in the Swedish dictionary in 2015 and is now in wide use, including newspaper articles and official documents. Now, as regards gender neutrality in English, there has been a long practice of using the so-called generic masculine, where the pronoun he is used to represent all of humanity or any individual regardless of gender. Similarly, masculine forms of gendered nouns are often used in both Swedish and English as the generic form, whereas the feminine forms are used exclusively to refer to those classed as women. What research has found in multiple contexts, though, is that these masculine generics are not in fact generic. Rather, they tend to display what we call a male bias in linguistic representation. That is, when a person reads a text and sees a masculine generic, they tend to mentally represent the person the text is about as a man, rather than their mental representation being gender neutral. This same male bias has also been demonstrated with other supposedly gender-neutral terms like the applicant or even the term humanity. So under the umbrella term of gender-fair language reforms, there have been different suggestions for how we can reduce this male bias. Balancing, also known as feminization, is a strategy that tries to include both masculine and feminine forms into the same word or phrase. For instance, replacing the masculine generic he with the paired form he, she, or including two forms of the same gender job title in an advertisement, like actor and actress rather than just actor, chairman and chairwoman, etc. Another available strategy is neutralization. Now, this strategy aims to remove all, or as much as possible, of the gender connotations in a text by, for instance, replacing gender job titles with gender neutral ones. So policeman becomes police officer, rather than policeman and policewoman, and or removing gendered pronouns in favor of gender neutral alternatives like singular they. Now, balancing and neutralization have both been shown to have the potential to decrease some gender bias in different contexts, but they also come with potential side effects. Balancing as a strategy may have the unintentional side effect of presenting gender as an exclusively binary structure, as well as being exclusionary to those who identify outside of the categories of women and men. Now, neutralization in turn risks evoking forms of bias such as a male bias due to the tendency of high status groups to be the unnamed reference group that we use when we encounter neutrality. Now, previous research on who is represented, linguistically represented by balancing and neutralization strategies has focused on categories of women and men in general, which is likely to have activated associations to prototypical women and men whose gender expression conforms to gender norms. The ability of balancing or neutralization to linguistically represent also those with a non-normative gender expression is what we set out to test in the two experiments that I am presenting today. So what we did were two online experiments conducted in a Swedish sample and an English-speaking sample from the United States. The setup of both experiments were the same, in that participants were asked to read a fictional job advertisement for an open position as train attendant, and then read a description of an applicant for that position that was supposedly written by a professional recruiter. The job of train attendant was chosen because it is not what we call a gender type job. And there is a roughly equal division of women and men in both the United States and in Sweden who work as train attendants today. And the job requires both stereotypically feminine and stereotypically masculine skills, and that it is a service job that requires technical skills. Similarly, the description of the applicant was also balanced between presenting social and technical qualities, with only the pronoun used to refer to the applicant differing between conditions. In experiment 1, the applicant was referred to using either the Swedish han, hon, so he, she, or hen, the gender-neutral neo-pronoun. And in experiment 2, the applicant was referred to using either he, she, she, or they. After having read the description of the applicant, participants were asked to pick who they thought the applicant was from a selection of photos, what we'll show in a second. Now, actually. So the way that we chose to measure who is linguistically represented by different pronoun forms was through letting participants choose 1 out of 8 photos that they believed showed the person they just read about. These photos were selected from stock photo websites to look similar to the types of photos that are often attached to job applications. Participants were allowed to choose from 4 photos of individuals with a normative gender expression and 4 photos of individuals with a non-normative gender expression. 2 women and 2 men respectively, as determined by their classification on the stock photo website. Now, all photos were pre-tested with a Swedish pilot sample, who rated the individuals in the photos regarding the extent to which they thought the person looked like a typical man and looked like a typical woman. Also, what personal pronoun they thought that this person preferred. The pre-testing confirmed that the photos we had classified as being of gender normative women were seen as feminine but not masculine, and the participants believed that they preferred the pronoun she. Normative men were perceived as masculine but not feminine and as preferring the pronoun he, whereas the non-normative individuals were seen as really neither a typical woman nor a typical man, and their assumed preferred pronoun was split between both he, she, and hen. So what we will be looking for then in the results, I'm going to show on the next slide, is what proportion of participants in each condition, so each pronoun condition that was included in the text, chose a photo of a person with a normative versus a non-normative gender expression. And if this proportion significantly differs from the 50-50 split that would be expected to happen if the pronoun evoked equal associations to both normative and non-normative individuals. And that is what this graph presents, the proportion of photos chosen in each condition, from left to right for the conditions han, hon, hen, they, hen, he, she, they, and sie. And as you may or may not see here, hen hen was the only condition that did not display a significant normative bias. So participants who read a text using hen chose normative and non-normative photos in a proportion that did not differ from chance. That was a 57-43% split. Whereas in the remaining conditions, participants chose between 70 to 78%. 70 to 78% of participants chose a photo of a normative individual. So as we hypothesized, using the paired form he, she in either Swedish or English made individuals more likely to picture a prototypical gender normative person, while individuals with a non-normative gender expression were made less visible. There also appears to be a difference in who can be represented by gender-neutral pronouns in Swedish and English, where the Swedish hen shows no normative bias, but both singular they and she in English does. Now, hen and she are both neo-pronouns, but one difference between them could be how well known they are as non-binary pronouns. We therefore asked our US participants how familiar they were with both singular they and she as non-binary pronouns, and also tested if the pattern of normative bias was different for people familiar or unfamiliar with this pronoun usage. Fortunately for people in the United States, unfortunately for us, 99% of our US sample were familiar with the use of singular they as a non-binary pronoun, which means that we could not compare participants who were familiar to those who were unfamiliar because there were just too few unfamiliar. Now for C, only 35% of our US sample were familiar with its use as a non-binary pronoun. So we therefore looked at if the discovered normative bias following C was caused by those unfamiliar with the pronoun, or if it was present for both groups. And this graph shows the proportion of normative and non-normative photo choices for participants in the C condition who were either familiar with C as a non-binary pronoun or not familiar. Now, both those familiar and unfamiliar displayed a normative bias, where they were more likely to believe that the text referred to a person with a normative gender expression compared to a non-normative gender expression. However, this normative bias was significantly smaller for those familiar with C as a non-binary pronoun. So what conclusions can we draw from these studies, and what do we do with this information? Well, when it comes to linguistic representations of individuals with a non-normative gender expression, using the paired pronoun he, she did lead to a normative gender bias in both Swedish and English. However, it also seems that not all non-binary pronouns are created equal. The only pronoun that did not lead to a normative bias in mental representation was Swedish hen, whereas English non-binary pronouns she and singular they were both seen as more likely to apply to a person with a normative gender expression compared to a non-normative gender expression. However, we could see that for the neo-pronoun she, being familiar with it, decreased normative bias among participants. So it seems that the best candidate for achieving equal representation of individuals of different gender expressions is an actively created pronoun that is well known to users. Now, unlike hen and she, singular they is a pronoun with a long and complex history of use, where the gender neutral usage may still be more common than the non-binary usage, potentially making it vulnerable to the same biases as other neutral terms, where neutrality leads to stronger associations to high status groups. That still needs to be investigated further. Now, there are, of course, some limitations in these experiments that impact the strength of the conclusions we can draw. First of all, we made use of a simulated recruitment context and a non-gender type job in order to be able to isolate the effect of gender normativity as much as possible. And while this is good practice to have high internal validity, it does not fully capture the complex nature of a recruitment situation where gender normativity of an applicant is likely to interact with job and organization specific factors. One such factor is the gender typing of the profession in question, and future research should continue to test the extent to which information about gender distribution in a profession influences the mental representations that gender neutral or non-binary pronouns evoke. In addition, future research should continue to test how information regarding membership in different social categories influences perception of non-normativity in gender expression. We know, for instance, that ethnicity is correlated with perceptions of gender normativity and non-normativity, and that should be included in research on what type of gender non-normativity is made more or less visible through the use of different forms of gender-fair language. And I would like to end now with some implications that this research has for practitioners. Because investigating linguistic representations of different pronouns may seem like a pretty theoretical endeavor. But the language used between organizations, employees, potential employees can play a large role in increasing or decreasing the inclusion of different minority groups at a workplace. And this is because language use in organizational communication signals to both potential and current employees how they can expect individuals with a specific social identity to be treated in the organization. So in order to increase feelings of exclusion and decrease discriminatory experiences among individuals with a non-normative gender expression, it is important that an organization works actively with this language use. Including non-binary pronouns in organizational communication can be a way to signal that individuals with non-normative gender expressions are represented and valued within an organization. Individuals with non-normative gender expressions are a heterogeneous group, and working to increase inclusion for this group will act to benefit a diverse range of gender and sexual minorities. But don't be afraid to use different non-binary pronouns in your organizational communication. And try to, again, just be aware of what you wish to communicate and to whom, and what the recommended ways of doing that are. So thank you very much for your attention today.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation, Amanda. It was really fascinating and some very important work that you're doing. Just so that we can kick off the question and answers component of the session today, I wanted to ask you a question that I was thinking about while your presentation was going. And maybe I'll leave one of the questions to the end, but one of my questions I had, I saw on your slide that you had the different conditions, and it was a little bit fast for me, and I'm sure some other people probably jumped in at different parts, but I was wondering what forms of like non-conforming or non-binary kind of gender expression pronouns were facing kind of more backlash, or like, do you expect there to be more backlash for certain types of gender expression in terms of linguistically, or some having less? And why might that be happening? Is it a lack of representation? Is it a lack of education? You know, what could you perhaps, for the practitioners in the room, share about the insights of your particular experiments and how they might apply that into their organizations?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And yeah, so for these experiments, we tested, I think part of the focus was on singular they, because it is such I mean, pretty well used gender neutral pronoun. So we were honestly a bit surprised to see that it displayed such a large tendency to sort of linguistically represent gender normative people to the extent, well, to the exclusion of people with a non-normative gender expression. So from this data, I mean, for what I presented here, I would recommend, as I said, using one of the actively created neo-pronouns, but then we run into the issue of them having to be also familiar to participants. So I can say from an earlier experiment that we also did, where we looked at how we can include gender inclusive language in organizational descriptions, that sort of mixing and matching also with pronouns and being quite explicit about what you want can be a very good idea. Because what we did there was look at the impact of these explicit equal employment statements. So when we say we are looking for, the classic one is we are looking to employ women and men in equal balance. So we checked some different versions of that, and we found that when you explicitly state that we are looking to employ people of a diverse background with different gender identities, and include things like different types of pronouns. So I think in this study we had, it was in Swedish, so we had, well, one of them was in Swedish, so we had that hen pronoun as well. And what we did find was that people belonging to a gender minority were more attracted to this organization that had used this gender inclusive language, whereas cis people weren't really affected. They liked the organization fine either way. So based on those together, I would say, I mean, use both if you want to be as inclusive as possible.
So practically speaking, if an organization wants to attract more non-binary people or people with different gender expressions, all they need to do is just be inclusive of those people in the descriptions, right?
Yeah, at least if in that first stage of getting somebody's attention and getting them interested in getting more information about the company, because that's after that we get into the more tricky portion, that if you seem inclusive in your communication, people will also expect you to be inclusive in your practices.
Sure.
And that could potentially be a mismatch, of course. So, but hopefully, of course, the practices will also be inclusive. So then you can use that gender fair language or gender diverse language to get the attention of as wide a pool of applicants as possible. Because then you will also, of course, as an organization, have a larger chance of capturing the most qualified individual if you make your pool of applicants as wide as possible.
Sure. So I have one more, we will probably have time for one more question or two if we concise. We have one question about the methodology of your study. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that, which was, did you collect data about age, generation, or gender identity of survey respondents?
Yes, let's see, I didn't include that detail here, but we have, see if I can find it. For the Swedish sample, we had, I haven't written it in percentages here, so it might be a bit nonsense to you, but we had mainly, we had a majority of women in the sample, a good portion of men, and 2 individuals with a non-binary gender identity. And then in the US one, we had, again, a majority women, but a good portion of men, and we had 12 people with, to be quicker, some other form of identification.
Right.
And for age, it was a relatively young sample for both of the studies, but not overly young. I think the mean age was somewhere close to 40 for both of them.
Sure. Okay, one more question, and then I think we will have to leave it there. So I'm going to combine some thoughts that people were sharing in the chat, which was around when looking at advertising for careers and progression and recruitment, how do we balance ensuring inclusion of non-conforming genders while being mindful of people feeling alienated by pronouns, not seemingly including their identity of traditional he, she identities, and also how do we have these conversations in the workplace if we're still kind of transitioning in the workplace to become more inclusive of these types of people?
Yeah, I think those are, let's see if I remember the first question. I apologize, I'm a little bit slow because I'm a bit tired.
No,
so
that's okay.
I missed you,
how do we find a balance of ensuring inclusion of non-conforming genders while being mindful of people feeling alienated by these pronouns?
Yeah, that's it's a really tricky question, isn't it? Because it's all about whatever language we use, we will be sending signals to somebody, right? So the question is, who do we want to signal what to? And what I can say from previous research on this type of, as an organization, what we want to communicate to is that there is some research indicating that when you use sort of affirmative action statements or other equal employment statements, you may run the risk of alienating some members of higher status groups. Now, as I said, the study that my research group did found that higher status groups weren't really alienated by a very sort of inclusive statement where we it wasn't an affirmative action statement that said that, for instance, women will receive career support. But this was more the type of statement that mentioned sort of every type, well, every type, but a lot of different types of gender identities, etc. So in that way, everybody was mentioned, which seems to have helped to not make it threatening for at least our sample. So I think it is a tricky thing. I agree with that. So there's no real easy answer to it, but it all has to do with who do you want to attract, and who are you okay with maybe risking to alienate in a specific context. But again, it doesn't seem like gender inclusive language is that alienating really to a large group of people. So that might be good. And then for the question of how to have conversations in the workplace about gender fair language, I guess that depends on who you're talking to. If your goal is sort of to talk to your organizational leadership to implement more gender fair language, I think arguments such as, well, we want to attract as many people as possible to apply for our jobs because we want to attract the best applicant. So this is the way we can do that. I think that can be a really effective strategy.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your insights, Amanda. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I wish you all the best with publishing this research and advancing it further. Thank you for the work.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody.